Good morning, everyone. This is Katie calling from Premier Marketing. Wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us this morning. This morning, I am thrilled to have Larry Moore, who is Vice President of Sales of Lincoln Financial. He is here to help us get some ideas on opening the discussion for long-term care sales. So with no further ado, Larry, you ready to take it away?
I am ready. All righty. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's actually quite early out here in the West Coast, so I know your day's probably well underway. But the goal of today's call is to perhaps give you a different perspective about long-term care planning and long-term care insurance. Yeah, I say that because I've been doing this for a little over 30 years. I know the same old tired arguments, the same old tired language, and I think a lot of that gets in the way both of you being enthusiastic about this potentially and also your clients being enthusiastic about it. So hopefully today what I'm going to share with you is some different terminology, a different approach to how you would initiate the conversation. And, well, hopefully we'll get something out of this. I'm going to share with you some PowerPoint slides, of course, and then share with you some numbers in terms of how to get a grasp around the asset-based type product, which is MoneyGuard in this case. So with that, let's just get right down to the agenda. Obviously, there's dilemmas all around, but there's actually a dilemma that the advisor shares too, and oftentimes I have to remind them of that. And the only reason I feel strongly about that is I did this to my grandfather's advisor. We took care of him in our home for about 4 years. So what I'm sharing with you actually comes from my life's experience. We're going to talk about the myths that your clients have, and it's interesting, these same myths are also harbored by a lot of advisors and insurance brokers as well. Then we're going to get into society's view. This is where it gets interesting because I think this is where the major roadblocks occur when trying to open somebody up in a dialogue about long-term care planning, because society people have preconceived ideas about what they think long-term care is, and because it's such a rosy idea, a rosy picture in their mind, they shut right down. We'll get to the end of this with talking about who's at risk. It might be a little more expansive than you probably originally thought, and then ultimately understanding long-term care planning. So the goal is to get through this in the next 30 minutes, and here we go. First of all, the advisor's dilemma, and this will be the broker's dilemma too. It's very simple. Your phone could ring tomorrow, and when you pick up the handset, you think it's your client. It's not. It's their grandchild or their child or maybe even their spouse letting you know that there's been a major change in someone's health. And in fact, maybe it's a stroke. Maybe it was an accident. One way or another, somebody has become chronically disabled, and now you need to find a way, if you're the one handling the money as the advisor, to fund the cost of their long-term care. I think an interesting way to bring this up with your clients is that you use the same wording. It's a very easy discussion to have. If you get your client on the phone or you're face-to-face, I would just open up with something along the lines of, I have this dilemma with you, and it's the same dilemma that I have with all of my clients. Is it one morning when I least expect it, my phone will ring, and I will think it's you, and it's not. It's your child or it's your spouse calling me to let me know that you've had a stroke, or letting me know that you've been in a terrible accident and it looks like you may be going through a long-term recovery. However you slice it, that phone call means it's going to become a very costly situation, and guess what? No planning in place. So what I would like to do is open your eyes up to this reality that you face and share with you some strategies that I think will be helpful in terms of guiding the discussion around another way to plan for long-term care. Something like that. Just tell them you have a dilemma with them. I think that'll just open up the discussion in a very easy, natural way, and you'll have them leaning in. When we look at the myths out there, gosh, these are the same myths Katie and I have seen for years in this business. It won't happen to me. Well, we know 1 out of 2 people upon turning age 65 will need long-term care. The problem is, what's the magnitude of that? Nobody knows. When you think of risk and the odds are 50-50 it could happen, well, that's actually a pretty high likelihood. The second myth that I won't go into a lot today at all has to do with what the government provides, whether it's Medicare or Medicaid. As long as you leave this call today understanding that neither Medicare nor Medicaid is a solution for most people that's really all you need to know. Medicare is a program that's designed for acute care needs, meaning you go to the hospital because of something acute or sudden, swift and dramatic. Fine, it's going to give you some short-term medically related care, but for long-term care, it's not a resource. And Medicaid, of course, is welfare. So that's a whole nother story. And if you're working with an advisor, the goal is to not even wind up close to that. The third one's interesting because that's what my savings are for. What is the rainy day? You're saving for the rainy day. We're kind of experiencing a rainy day with this COVID-19 reality. Well, really, is that what your savings are for? Because the rainy day we're talking about with regard to a long-term care event for one person, let alone two, is more like a hurricane. It's not just a rainy day. It's a situation that can devastate someone's finances in very short order. So when we think about savings moving forward, think of two things. What are my objectives and goals for retirement? When I think of retirement, that's at a time in my life where work can become optional, right? Or two, what are my legacy objectives? What do I want to see happen with this money once I'm in another world, right? So that's what savings are for. And long-term care planning is the defensive strategy to make sure that those ideas that you have, that your clients have, actually happen. And then the big one, my family will be able to take care of me. And the answer is your family will be engaged one way or another, having been there myself. If you have children or loved ones that are far, far away, they will be engaged emotionally. If you have children or family that are local, is that really what you want to do to them? That's the bigger question, because ideally you want your family to be there present and in good health and available to be a companion, to be available to you in a lot of other ways other than the most challenging ways, which is at the level of caregiving. So when you think about the four myths, they've been that way forever, and the question is, how do we thwart those from happening? Well, here's a great place to go, because this is where I find there's so many misconceptions that are harbored deep within someone's soul when they think about long-term care. And I love to ask this question, and this is a question you can ask your clients. In fact, I always ask this question whenever I open up a client workshop. When you visualize long-term care, what do you see? Right? That's the question. What do you see when you hear that term? And it's not a very rosy picture. In fact, it's kind of a grim reaper world. People typically see elderly, sick people in an institutionalized environment like a nursing home. Even though more than half of our claims at Lincoln are home care claims, what people see is this pretty dim, grim reaper type image. And I can't blame them, because my industry's been hammering home on that idea for the last 30, 40 years. Right? So when you think about what it is that you see, the answer is yes. You typically see something like this, the elderly or people that are aging. And that's true. I mean, when you think about where we are now, people are living longer and longer. There's no mystery to that. What does that mean? It means simply that the longer we live, the greater our exposure to chronic and debilitating conditions associated with age are. They also see this. We see in bigger numbers more and more Alzheimer's cases. Now, Alzheimer's is not a virus or a pandemic. It's simply a function of numbers. And ironically, the more people that age, guess what? The more people are going to succumb to this disease. But we're also getting much better at detecting it earlier. So that also kind of skews the numbers even further. But ultimately, when we think about the risk, and we're going to touch on this one more time in this presentation, women are more at risk to this than men. And primarily, it's very simple. Genetics, they outlive us. That's the bottom line. When you look at any long-term care facility, guess what? The predominant residents there are female, not male. So when we think about this risk, not only think about the family, but think about women and how they're impacted by this, because I'm going to go into that in a deeper way as we get into this presentation. But when we think about long-term care, we've talked about these myths, harboring your vision of what you see with long-term care. Here's where I want you to start first. Oops. The way we define long-term care is either going to be something of a physical nature or a cognitive nature. Whether it's Medicare or there's a tax-qualified long-term care insurance contract, they're going to recognize that someone is disabled either physically, which is their need for assistance with performing 2 of 6 basic activities of daily living without the help of another or with the help of another, or the need for constant supervision due to cognitive impairment. Now, that's a pretty broad one because I'm 55 and my wife would accuse me of needing supervision all the time, but that's a whole other issue. But you notice nowhere in here does it say anything about age. It doesn't say that you have to be in your 80s to need long-term care. That's what's important. This is a matter of disability, but a disability that could last a long time, one you may recover from or one you may not. So it's fraught with unknowns, but it's something that's not going to get away from us in less than 90 days in most cases. And when we think about disability and you think about how we're talking about long-term care here, it's getting us now down to a pre-retiree person. In fact, I have some famous, well-known people. You may have heard of these names. Michael J. Fox, actor, right? He's in his 50s. He has Parkinson's disease, young man. Christopher Reeves, Superman, if you recall that person, thrown from a horse during an equestrian event, suffered an irreversible spinal cord injury. Now, this man was a physical specimen before that happened. Last thing you would ever imagine, right? He became paralyzed, of course. Now, Patricia Summit is an interesting case because it expands the notion of the impacts of Alzheimer's. If you haven't heard of this person, she was the most successful basketball coach in college basketball history, men's and women's, of University of Tennessee. And at the peak of her career, she announced to the Board of Trustees that she had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Notice she died a short time later. And when she made her announcement, I watched the video. She was very sharp. You would not have known that she had Alzheimer's. There's a kind of Alzheimer's that we're beginning to discover that doesn't necessarily mean the multi-year reality. Frontal temporal Alzheimer's is the most common form of Alzheimer's that we're discovering that impacts people between their 40s and 60s, and it doesn't have a long gestation period, unfortunately. But again, a young person, and actress Selma Blair is a new one I put on the list, a young person battling multiple sclerosis. I'm going to point to that statistic to the right. 40% of nursing home residents are actually under 65. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of younger people in nursing homes that are recovering from something, either a serious accident or a serious illness. And at the end of the day, that just underscores the real danger of the kind of risk we're talking about. It's one thing if it happens when you're very old, because theoretically you've saved all you can save, and that's the way it is. But in your pre-retirement years, like these people, when you're focused on building your retirement so work can be an option one day, it's particularly devastating because it would force you to start deconstructing your retirement before you're able to retire. And that's the danger. And that's why this can happen at any time. So when we kind of get down to who do we see at risk, all right, I already brought this up, right? Women. Women are far more likely to need this than men, but women are impacted by long-term care in many other ways that we don't often talk about. Caregiving. Like it or not, it's the way it is right now. Women are the predominant caregivers in a long-term care situation. And you can see the slippery slope. They're taking care of perhaps their husband or their father. Sometimes that's often the case. They're spending their time, their physical health and well-being, and ultimately the family's resources taking care of someone else. And then when it's their turn, what's left? That's the big reality here when we think about it. The impacts to women impacts them because they live longer and are more likely to need long-term care. And secondly, the other impact of them being caregiver. When we talk about caregiving and family members, they also are impacted. 40% of Americans age 40 and older have provided care and have experienced the causes and stresses of the family. I'm one of those people. I did this for 4 years with my wife, and I had to change my career. I had to do a number of things. I had 3 young children at the time. They're older now, but when we talk about the impacts to family members, it's not a particularly reliable resource because they have their own lives to lead. And to suddenly throw their world upside down, it's a question of, is that really what you want to see happen if you haven't planned for this yourself and you know that your clients are in the position to plan? So hopefully so far, as I kind of summarize all of this, at this point in the presentation, if you can take away the idea that age is not the sole factor of long-term care planning, but it's more a function of disability that can happen at a much broader age category. Now you've already identified a new way to approach your pre-retiree clients. Now, understanding long-term care planning and long-term care planning solutions, I'm not going to get into specific products at all. I'm going to just talk about this more as a subject matter. And the first question that I typically get once somebody is drawn into this business, one way or another, through their practice, or they say, I want to focus here, is how do I know what kind of plan to design? There's so many options to choose from, and especially how long do I build the coverage to last? And obviously, affordability is paramount. That's the number one issue. But don't get hung up on having to sell Cadillacs to somebody that should be driving, Ford Tauruses for that matter. There's a study that's done by one of our primary advocates in the industry, the American Association of Long-Term Care. They do a claim study about every 3 years. And it's a study industry-wide, not with a specific carrier, about how long claims last. And it's very interesting. I've seen 2 other studies that the LTC group put out years ago, and the numbers are very similar. So they don't change too much, meaning that a claim typically goes about the same amount of time. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this age band in the middle, age 75 to 84. When we look at claims in that category, that age category, 76% of them make it past the 90-day mark. Now, it's interesting. That sounds like a big number, but 24% of them didn't get that far. And that's a large number of people. And, to put this in perspective, the industry has paid out well over $12, $13 billion in claims. Lincoln alone last year, Lincoln Financial, we paid out $78 million just last year. So when you think 24% of claims industry-wide don't make it to the 90-day mark, that's a big number. But 76% make it past the 90-day mark. 52% make it past the first year. 36% make it past the second year. 24% the third year. Only 15% are making it past the fourth year, and barely 10% are making it past the fifth year. So what am I telling you here? There's nothing wrong with selling a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year plan. There's nothing wrong with that. So I see some advisors saying, well, what if it's Alzheimer's and it goes on for many, many years? Well, not every case follows that glide path, right? So this gives you a sense that obviously the insurance itself, whether it's a traditional long-term care product or an asset-based product like ours, the premiums are not insignificant. So when you keep this in mind, that 3 years, 4 years, 5 years is doing a good job for the vast majority of people on claim, I would say, stick with that. It'll give you at least some confidence that you don't have to oversell on the coverage side to forsake the sale. But coming back to the nature of this risk, we talk about a 50-50 chance of occurrence, and that's a high likelihood. The challenge that we have is the exposure. It's anybody's guess. It could be a few weeks, a few months, a few years, or many years. We just don't know. But what it ultimately introduces to your client's reality is a cash flow crisis. That's what this is at the end of the day. It's not about asset protection. That's a good term to use if you're flying at 40,000 feet. But feet on the street, what does this mean? It means that my cost of living is tripled overnight. I'll give you a perfect example of my grandfather's situation. When we talk about the advisor's dilemma, I was the one that was able to make that call. And it was very interesting because when my grandfather's advisor, my grandfather's name was John, when his broker picked up the phone, thought it was my grandfather calling, he said, "John, how are you?" I said, "This isn't John, this is Larry." And all he could say was, "Oh?" You could have heard a pin drop. But the bottom line is this: the conversation went something like this. He said, "Grandpa's going to need some help now. It's going to be a little over 10 grand a month. And we need your direction. If you haven't done any planning for him around this, what's the best way to start liquidating this portfolio without doing the most damage to it," right? Not a nice conversation to have. But at 90 years old, because suddenly we had this new demand for income, because that's when you start liquidating investments, it's income all of a sudden. he was thrust into 2 tax brackets higher than he had been in for many years. So now, at this stage in his life, needing long-term care, 90 years old, he has a tax problem. We don't think about these things when we think about the cash flow crisis. So that's another thing you want to think about, is that, you know, the big problem is that it's going to impact people at the level of cash flow. So when we talk about, in a bigger picture, what this is, you know, without incorporating long-term care planning, you're positioned to liquidate. That is the plan. And the process begins, it begins the process, as I say, of deconstructing the portfolio or the goals that family may have had. It presents market exposure all of a sudden. I had a conversation, we're in the midst of COVID-19, I had a conversation just with this whole COVID-19 thing started with an advisor, and he's a friend of mine, and we talk a lot, and I asked him if he has any clients that are in any kind of extended need situation right now, extended care need, and he said, unfortunately, I have one. And he's needed long-term care for 8 months. We're liquidating his estate. It didn't look quite so bad when the markets were strong, but now it's awful because his portfolio is worth about 20% less than it was prior, and he's still having to liquidate assets. So market exposure now is a real reality for that person and others. You have income.
Hey, Larry, can I interrupt real quick?
You absolutely can.
Okay, we've got a question out here, and before we get too far away from that slide, it says,
sure.
When looking at the need during risk management and how long, years versus percentage, is this pertaining to skilled nursing and home care costs or just skilled nursing facilities? So the last slide that you had up.
Very good question. It's long-term care claims in general. So when we think about skilled nursing, it's interesting. About 52% of our claims are home care claims. And when we look industry-wide, we see a similar kind of breakdown. And then from there, the next largest group is going to be assisted living and nursing homes. Skilled nursing is becoming a smaller and smaller subset of that. Good question. Any other questions?
No, I think we've handled it. I'm getting a lot of questions about having recordings and stuff like that. But as people do have any questions, please feel free to type them in.
You got it. Okay. So these are the exposures, right, that people face when you have to suddenly liquidate: capital gains exposure. Now, impacts on legacy. I want to comment on this too, because oftentimes what comes along with the retirement planning strategy is a legacy plan, whether it's to, you know, pass the family farm on to the kids, or is it to provide some sort of gift to a school or an association you're part of. Sometimes people have very, very specific and important legacy plans that don't necessarily include the family. And my grandfather was one of those. He had started a dental school in San Francisco, and he had a significant gift in his estate that he had pledged to the school many, many years prior to him needing care. And that asset became his long-term care plan. So his legacy plans were shot out the door. So what are we talking about as we kind of summarize this whole thing about long-term care planning? Well, you're now looking at a defensive strategy. That's what it is. In fact, when we talk about this whole COVID-19 thing, this is very interesting because never have we ever thought of factoring in pandemic into our risk management lexicon. We never thought of it. I've never seen a situation in my life where a government can shut down economic consumption in 24 hours, right? So when we think about long-term care planning, frankly, there's never been a better time to bring this up. And I tell you this because look how swiftly all of this happened. And if you fell into a long-term care situation now, when your portfolios are suddenly overnight worth less than they were before, how on earth could you ever plan for this, right? And I think that's a fair statement. How do you plan for this? Well, that's why taking a more defensive posture in your planning is a sensible discussion to have. And when you see the next bullet, this is the foundation to protecting plan objectives. Long-term care planning is that. Why is it foundational to someone's estate planning? Because this becomes the primary source of funding for a long-term care event, not the portfolios that you may be managing for your clients or that somebody else is, right? So this becomes foundational. And obviously, a predictable, reliable, guaranteed source of funding that you know will be there. Ultimately, when you introduce long-term care planning, and these are the conversations you have with your clients, is you're now showing them a strategy of maximization, maximizing the likelihood that their plans in retirement will fulfill. That's the important part. You're not going to be forced to take it apart. You're going to be in a position to protect it. And then I think the most appealing side to the story has to do with the tax treatment of tax-qualified long-term care, IRS code 7702B. And if you have an accountant, bring this one up to them, because it's oddly enough, a lot of them aren't real familiar with this. But you're using tax-free dollars also. Not one penny of the distribution out of a long-term care policy is going to be taxable, which is pretty powerful. So, the one strategy that you have at your disposal, obviously you have traditional long-term care insurance, which plays a role. Asset-based products like ours are different in that there's certain guarantees associated with them. We use the term live, die, quit. If you live and need long-term care, you've got a leveraged, tax-free source of cash flow. If you never need it, it pays a death benefit. If you decide to surrender the contract, you have cash value. What's nice about this strategy, especially in times of uncertainty, is it's fraught with guarantees, right? You got guaranteed premiums, guaranteed death benefits, guaranteed cash values. If you're going to make premium payments, the premiums are guaranteed. So if in a sense traditional long-term care insurance isn't the right solution necessarily, but it is for others, this is the right solution for other people. You have, working with Katie, you have multiple strategies at your disposal, and I'm a big advocate of any kind of long-term care planning. Traditional long-term care insurance is going to be a much less expensive proposition than asset-based products like ours, but you'll get the guidance from Katie and Premier Marketing about how this all comes together. But ultimately, in terms of ways to fund an asset-based strategy, there are a number of them. Think about assets that are sitting there not doing anything. You can reposition those assets to fund a strategy. You can repurpose assets. When we talk about an asset-based play like MoneyGuard, for instance, you're talking about a life insurance contract, a guaranteed universal life insurance contract with an extension rider on it. That means you can, instead of using it just for death benefits, you can use it for long-term care. Well, if you have an old life insurance contract that you'd like to repurpose through 1035 exchange, that's a way to fund it. If you have clients who have good income, and it wouldn't be prudent to move a big asset out of the way to fund it, well, then you have flexible premium payment options. This isn't all forced into a single pay solution. And actually, there's also ways to fund premiums using business assets as well. Those are whole nother subjects. But with that being said, this kind of completes the whole long-term care planning discussion. And what I want to do now is share some ideas around leverage. And again, what I'm going to show you is not about pushing a product concept per se, but giving you a sense of what numbers look like. And what I have here is a 58-year-old female who's opted to have a 5-year policy. And this happens to be Lincoln MoneyGuard. Other carriers that play in the asset-based space would be like One America, Securian, and so on. But to give you a sense of the leverage, this is somebody who says, I want this, but I can't afford to pay for it all at once. Can I make installments? Kind of like making payments on a loan. Can I make installments on my policy? And the answer is yes. So this is a 12-pay scenario, $11,900 a year. Once all the premiums are paid, she will have paid $142,000. Now, what do you get for that $142,000? Well, in the first year, year one, it looks pretty attractive. And if I can play with a little pencil here with the highlighter, oops, I'm not going to because that's going to be a problem. Okay. When you look at what you get day one, $5,000 a month tax-free or $60,000 a year tax-free, that's how it comes out of a pool worth $318,000. When I think about the growth within this contract, it's guaranteed to grow at 3% compound. Pretty nice. And it's going to give you 5 years of benefits, no waiting period on this contract. There's no elimination period to it. And of course, if you never need the money and pass away first, you're going to get $130,000 in death benefits. So that's pretty attractive. But when you look at this over the course of years, this is where the rubber starts to meet the road. So you can see your, year one, 58 years old. I pay my first premium of $11,000. It's giving me that death benefit of $130,000, but it's giving me access to a tax-free pool of money, $318,000. Now, I'm going to take you down the policy year column, down to policy year 26, age 83. Now, I use age 83 only because that's our average claim age, and I'm going to roll this up a little bit. But when you look at that age 83 number and you take into account, what do I have to work with here? Well, by age 83, I've created $666,000 of tax-free liquidity for long-term care, all from $149,000 investment. That gives me $125,000 a year to draw from, or $10,469 a month tax-free. You'll also notice, you see that $10,469 number right there in the far right side. You notice that number goes up each year. That's because you built an inflation rider into this. It's going to grow the value of that contract guaranteed as long as you're drawing from it, right? If you don't fully utilize the benefit, it could last longer. But if you utilize the whole benefit, it'll give you 6 years of coverage. Now, I want to hit this point home with one last analysis to give you some perspective. With this tool, I'm going to start off with some factors here. Got a 58-year-old. They're in the 28% tax bracket. This is an analysis tool that I think you'll really like, and you can ask Katie for it whenever you run an illustration, because I think it makes the discussion around long-term care planning very easy. And before I get into this, Katie, I'm noticing that it looks like the chat box is blinking. Are there any questions you want to address right now, or shall I keep going?
No, that was just, I had put a message out there to please type in any questions. One quick question, though, before you do jump into this. We do have somebody asking if MoneyGuard would qualify for partnership.
Good question, and the answer is no, because what this is a life insurance contract at its core. And when you think about partnership products, there's certain features and functions that are akin to traditional long-term care insurance. Now, your partnership program in Nebraska might be different than the one in California or New York, so I would have to honestly research that one for your state. But I'm going to say right now, to be safe, that this would not be a partnership certified product.
You're right, Larry. There's no state in which they'll allow for the partnership qualification because it's filed as a life chassis.
Exactly. Okay, so we nailed that one. Okay, so here's the scenario I'll lay out for you. This 58-year-old female, she's in the 28% tax bracket. She goes on claim at age 83. Now, she doesn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars just laying around to throw into this, but she does have income, and she could, between pulling some assets and some income, come up with an annual premium payment of $11,902 a year for 12 years, right? So what I'm going to show you here is a discussion you can have that she has some choices here. She could either fund this privately through self-funding, or she can buy insurance. There's a consequence to each decision that I'll show you in a few minutes. But what I like about this is it puts you in a position of objectivity to have this discussion. Also, if you have very affluent clients who truly are in the position to self-fund, this analysis will get you a lot closer to getting them to come to your side of the table, because when they look at this, oftentimes they say, wow, this is pretty compelling. Why wouldn't I do this? So anyway, with that, let's say I'm going to provide you two options in terms of self-funding. One of them is a very safe one. I'll call it a laddered CD fund or a bond fund, but it's not going to give you a great rate of return. After tax, you're only going to get 1.2% after tax rate of return on this thing. However, it's safe. It's safe insofar as you know the money's always going to be there. It's terrible when it comes to performing against inflation, but that's your bird in the hand. Secondly, we're going to look at option two, which is instead of playing the so-called safe route, you're young enough, let's put it in the market. After tax rate of return on average in the stock market, it's about 6%, whether it's mutual funds or individual stock funds. Seems to be that the common consensus is that's a fair after-tax rate of return on average, 6%. And what we're going to do is compare those two strategies in terms of their outcome by the time you reach age 83 to if I took that same $11,000 a year and over a 12-year period, put it into MoneyGuard. So on the top end, I'm dollar cost averaging into these two different investments over a 12-year period, see what the outcome looks like with that. Meanwhile, I'm making, you could also call it dollar cost averaging into MoneyGuard over 12 years for a 5-year plan. Let's see what that looks like, right? By age 83, it's pretty interesting. You can't outperform the leverage of insurance. Don't care how sharp of an investment advisor you are, but when you think about the guaranteed solution of a long-term care planning strategy, for instance, with MoneyGuard or products like it, that green bar represents the purchasing power I would achieve by age 83 with MoneyGuard. I don't get too far along with that safe bird in the hand investment, that blue bar. When you look at the yellow bar where I'm taking risk in the market, I don't get very far either, considering I'm taking risk. If I drop you down just a little bit below that bar graph where you see in bold at 1.2% and at 6%, if I decided to go with that safe investment, you say, Larry, you know what? I'm just going to put this money away in a really safe place, not take any risk with it. So if I ever need it, it's going to be there. Well, if you make that decision, the consequence to that decision means that you've left over $498,000 of purchasing power on the table as opposed to using the insurance. Likewise, taking risk in the market means you would have left over $337,000 of potential purchasing power for long-term care on the table had I not gone with the insurance vehicle. If I take you down to this chart, you'll notice when this person makes their first premium of $11,000, first premium payment of $11,902, that very day, she has $318,000 of tax-free leverage. Meanwhile, and if she passes away, of course, that year, she has a $130,000 death benefit. However, as you're looking over here, if she just started investing or funding these two investments over the next 12 years, she wouldn't have much at all to work with if she needed care that year. But let's say by age 83, many years later, that simple investment has garnered over $667,000 of tax-free liquidity. Meanwhile, taking you all the way to the right side where you see your investment rate of return in the stock market, you'd only have $329,000 to work with. Meanwhile, you're taking risk there. So I just wanted to show you this because what you're able to do with this analysis is have a very open, objective dialogue about, well, let's look at what your alternatives are. If you went with strategy one, what's the consequence of making that strategy? Strategy two, there's a consequence to that. Or if we leverage your money in a guaranteed insurance strategy that's going to provide tax-free cash flow, what does that look like? And that's what rounds all this up. And that's what long-term care planning is all about. It's about capital efficiency and tax efficiency. And the thing is, you have the strategies out there to engage in these discussions, and you've got an expert like Katie in the house to guide you all the way. So, Katie, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Larry, so much. We have a couple of questions that are starting to come in. So first one is going to be, is MoneyGuard available in New York, and are there any states in which it is not available?
Yeah, the answer is it is available in New York, but it's a very different product than you have in Nebraska. And I'll tell you that California and New York still have the old MoneyGuard 2 chassis, and they're different in of themselves too. But otherwise, yeah, available in every state.
Another question is when it comes to multi-pays and single premiums, what do you often see, and what would be some questions in order for them to determine? So basically some prospecting ideas.
Okay, so then the question was single premium versus multi-premium, is that right?
Yeah. So stats on a flex pay versus a single premium, it looks like, and then also,
right.
Questions to maybe be able to in the field better determine if the client was an option, which option would be available to them.
Sure. Great question. Historically, the asset-based product market has been a single premium market. What I mean historically, up to about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, most of the people buying a MoneyGuard type product were in the position to fund it all at once. So that's why it occupied such a small area of the marketplace. Now we've opened it up to what we call flex pay options. Depending on your age, you can apply for this coverage as young as 30 years old now. That's new. You can make premium payments up to age 70 now. So I can tell you that probably just within a year, I've seen dramatic growth in the flex pay business as opposed to the single pay business. And that's because now we've opened this up to the masses. You can call them the mass middle class, the working class, the pre-retirement class. So when we talk about funding this for somebody younger, right, I think a safe place to talk about this is introduce the concept like we have. Here's my dilemma with my clients is this, and my concern is what I'm aware of that you have at your disposal, is X amount of dollars. Now we have a tool called the asset identifier, and the asset identifier allows you to sit down with your client and say, okay, have you done any long-term care planning? No, I haven't. Okay, well then let's identify, if you needed long-term care tomorrow, which asset are you aware of that we would have to hit first? And how long would that last? Then we want to list your second asset that would be next in line. And I don't know what the third one is. Is it your home, right? That's a great place to start. And then I'm thinking with people that are, certainly in their pre-retiree stage in life, they're going to be the folks that are going to be looking at a 10 pay, a 12 pay, or paid up to age 70 of some sort, because they're still trying to build for retirement. And I think that's the big resistance that you'll find from somebody younger is they'll think, well, I don't just have $100,000 to lay around here. So yeah, but you know what? You have good income, and we can combine the income with maybe some of your assets to fund a premium and pay it up by the time you retire. And the paid up strategy is very, paid up to retirement, paid up to age 65 or 67 is becoming very attractive. And then also, if you own a business, there are ways to leverage excess retained earnings within your business, either by paying yourself a bonus through Section 162. And Katie, that might be a whole nother webinar that we do, or simply either a bonus or a way to pay yourself a dividend out of your own company. But those are some ideas.
Perfect. A couple more questions surrounding MoneyGuard. What does the underwriting look like? And what would be the requirements?
Good question. Very good question. Okay, so in Nebraska, you could be as young as 30 or as old as 80 to apply for this. I will be very straight with you. If you're in your late 70s, 77, 78, 79, the trade-off between the leverage and the premium pay is not very exciting at all. But with that being said, underwriting. Historically, underwriting has been kind of a sore point in long-term care because of how onerous of a process it is. Medical records, body fluids, the amount of time. We're pretty straightforward. It's an application, which we can do either electronically or paper, either way, and then a phone interview, and that's it. We don't go digging for medical records. So our process is pretty quick, and typically I'm seeing cases turn around in about 15 days on average, which is pretty fast. You'll have a decision pretty quickly. What we typically decline for, when you think about clients that might be prospects for this, if they're currently being treated for something, like if they're in physical therapy for an injury or something, they're going to have to wait till they're free of physical therapy. If they're over the age of 70 and have multiple underlying conditions at play, that's somebody that we're going to postpone. Now, if they're a 70-year-old in picture-perfect health, which there are some of those still, that's a person we would underwrite. But if it's, for instance, a 70-year-old who's a diabetic and also has some kind of cardiovascular disease of some sort, well, that's a person that will say, we're not going to decline you, but we're going to postpone you until we have a better idea what COVID-19 looks like, right? But when you get right down to it, if you're over the age of 60, part of that phone interview is a cognitive assessment, right? So that's just a series of questions we ask. And I will tell you, my counsel to you is when you are ready to have someone apply for long-term care with MoneyGuard, make sure they're very, I don't want to use the wrong words, make sure they're prepared. I could say coached, but make sure they're prepared to only answer the question that's asked, period. Don't go beyond that, right? But I think I could get you guys really deep in the weeds if I go to every scenario, but with regard to underwriting. But at the end of the day, if they're currently being treated for something that's serious, wait till that treatment's over, right? I think that's my counsel. And if I think one area that is kind of strange, and I'll just share this, if they're receiving cortisone injections and weight-bearing joints for pain, we won't look at that person because what we see is a hip replacement right around the corner or a knee replacement right around the corner. That's a strange one. Or if you visit the chiropractor more than twice a month. If it's less than twice a month, you're okay. If it's twice a month or more, we're going to say no. So I think the best thing you could do is reach out to Katie, reach out to me, and let us help you pre-qual that case first before you get too far down the road where you find, oh, there's some things I wasn't aware of. And sometimes they won't tell you everything. So anyway.
No, I think that's a great point. I'd like to point out, and just kind of as a reminder, a lot of our carriers have made adjustments due to COVID-19. We are starting to see timelines and hopefully some better news of insuring those older clients. However, if you are interested in the details on this specific to a carrier itself or just kind of a generalized broad description, please give me a call because I would be happy to go through that with you. I'm looking for any last questions, Larry. I think you did such a great job. I don't think there's very many that we haven't taken care of. That being said, I think that's it. I appreciate again everybody joining us this morning. If you have any questions, I would be happy to take a phone call or an email, and if I don't know the answer, we can always get Larry on the phone or somebody over there at Lincoln because they're always more than helpful. So I appreciate again, Larry, for you doing this for us, and want to wish everybody a happy Memorial Day weekend, and I look forward to getting together soon.